Hello my friends, welcome back to my channel. Today I have my September reading wrap up. So better late than never, right? Today I have just my September reading wrap up. I haven't even counted or broken it up into what I read or what genre or subgenre or whatever. I don't know. I just thought, you know what? I really want to get this video filmed and out, and so here it is. And yeah, well, let's go ahead and get into it. So I didn't read a ton of books. I think I read around 16 books this month, which is a lot for probably not like a bookish content creator, but for me that was kind of a lower reading month. And I also read more outside of the romance genre. Like I read a YA, I read a bunch of thrillers, but I did read, the majority is definitely romance. So let's go ahead and get started. The first book that I have to talk about is Moon Called by Patricia Briggs. This book has been on my TBR forever. I've owned this copy for years, I think, for at least 3 years. I think I bought this copy finally, was going to read it in 2020, and then I just never got around to it. And then on a live show, Jessica, not from Peace Love Books, but Jessica, I believe her Instagram is Golden Valkyrie, she said, Crystal, you need to read this series. I think you're going to really love it. And that put it back on my radar again. And I was like, oh yeah, I do want to read that. And I was in the mood for urban fantasy. And so I read this and I really enjoyed it. I gave this book 4 stars. Kazi, what are you doing? Cosmo, what are you doing? Dogs being doggos. So this is about our heroine she's actually called a skinwalker or a coyote shifter. Her next door neighbor is a werewolf, and it looks like there's going to be a romance there in the future. It definitely isn't here. This book was really more about setting up the world of, she works at this mechanic shop that's owned by vampires, and there's this whole system for how all these different creatures coexist and live in a functional society. And this werewolf shows up to work for her, or he's looking for a job or something, and she immediately senses something is off with him, and so she's trying to get him help and figure out what's going on, what the mystery is surrounding him, and that starts off a chain of events that really leads you into the meat of the story. So I really love this. I think Mercy is a very compelling character. I like how strong she is. I like how complicated she is, even though we didn't get to see a lot of that in this first book. Most of this book is setting up the world, so it did have some moments. Not too bad. I don't think the info dumpiness of this book was bad, but it definitely was there. But I just had a great time. I was very intrigued with the mystery that unfolds because of that werewolf who shows up on her porch, basically. And I just really liked the political setup of the vampires, werewolves, and she is a lone coyote shifter, skinwalker, so she's not as powerful as the werewolves, and I just think that is such a unique and interesting dynamic that I'm very excited to read future books. So I gave it 4 stars. I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to reading more. Okay, the next book that I read is Private Arrangements by Sherry Thomas. So Sherry Thomas is one of my favorite authors. I love her writing. I think she has such a way with words, and not just making pretty words, but making those beautiful words really evoke a feeling. I think that she is one of the, I don't know that I want to say few, but she's one of the, I guess, few historical romance authors who is able to create a really visceral reaction in me just from the words that she's using. Very few spare words, and all of a sudden I feel gut punched, I think all of her books have a pretty high degree of angst, and this one definitely did. But the interesting thing about Sherry Thomas for me, even though I say she's one of my favorite authors, I love her. She's written some of my favorite books of historical romance ever. But she also has written some historical romances that I absolutely did not like at all, 2 stars. And that's what happened here. Sadly, I gave this book 2 stars. This is basically a marriage in trouble, second chance almost type of romance, but it kind of defies tropes. I wouldn't go into this just based on those tropes, because a lot of this book is this couple, they marry, it's a marriage of, convenience, so not necessarily political, but, it's a good match, a good historical romance marriage match. And they end up presenting this version of them to society that says that they're just so happy, they have this great marriage, but they live on completely separate continents, maybe, is that right? Yeah, they live on separate continents. So they're estranged, but they're technically married, because when they first met, they did fall in love and they had a lot of feelings. And then on the day after their wedding, there's some betrayal that just erupts their marriage and just pushes them apart. So the whole entire book The whole entire book. You are dealing with the aftermath of that betrayal and how that has affected the two of them. And of course, the root cause for that betrayal is miscommunication. And I don't have a problem with miscommunication in historical romances, in any romances, because I just feel like it's very realistic. People are bad at communicating. People are bad at communicating when they feel vulnerable and also when they are afraid of getting hurt. That is what happened here. But it just felt like I was so frustrated with this because they were continuously making assumptions about one another, and the miscommunication was so strong. But also, this book dwells in a painful area for a very long time. Like, they do not like each other. They are cruel to each other, and it was just painful to read. So as much as I love and adore this author, this was a big miss for me, and I just felt like the end payoff, the overall happiness that they got, was not worth the suffering and the cruelty and the pain that they inflicted on each other, and it just wasn't a great read, and I was disappointed. So I am sad about that, but it was disappointing. Okay, the next book that I read is Daisy Hates by Jessica Hastings. So this is the second book in her, I don't actually know what the name of this series is called. I don't know if it's called Magnolia. I think it's just part of the Magnolia Parks universe. I read Magnolia Parks and I actually really enjoyed it. It was surprising and I found it very compelling and just very interesting. Surprisingly, I dedicated an entire video to Magnolia Parks. So I went into this with pretty, not necessarily high expectations, but I was like, okay, I'm ready for a similar type of reading experience. And it really was. It gave me a lot of the similar vibes, and I almost think that's something that was a detriment for my enjoyment of this, because the heroine in this, Daisy, she's basically a London mafia daughter, and her brother is her, what's the word, like guardian, so he's kind of raised her because their parents were killed when she was little, so he's extremely protective of her, and it has this really delightful found family aspect of all of the mafia boys, and they all really like band together, they protect her, she's like the mafia princess, so that was pretty fun. And the hero in this is Christian, who we met in the first book, and Daisy is in love with him. And this was kind of where I started having a problem, is that I really truly did not understand why she was so in love with him when he was so obviously carrying feelings for Magnolia. And I also just didn't see what was it in their interaction that would make her feel like he loved her or had feelings for her. There was just so much back and forth. It was basically the same cycle, the same scenarios as Magnolia Parks recycled here. Even the heroine doing some very similar things, like pulling Christian in and pushing him away. And I just was sort of like, I've seen this before. I feel like this author has potential to do some really unique and different things, and I didn't feel like she did that here. This felt like a recycle of Magnolia Parks, but without the angst. I mean, it is angsty, but without like that sense of rawness that I felt like Magnolia Parks had. I think that was one reason why I really enjoyed Magnolia Parks so much, is because it felt so raw, and I think that has so much to do with the stream of consciousness type of writing that had in it. And I think that Daisy has a much more clinical personality, so it was slightly difficult to really feel invested in her romance because of that clinical type of nature. But again, there were some of the same like writing tics that Jessa, is it Jessa? It is Jessa. I said Jessica. Jessa Hastings. I'm really not this bad at names, and then I get on camera and my mind is just like, poof, gone, everything. I honestly, the thing that I am corrected about most in my videos is character names, and I'm just terrible at names. I'm sorry, but Jessa Hastings. So I just felt like this book was underwhelming. I gave it 3 stars, and it didn't turn me off of this author, but it really made me much less excited to pick up the next book, even though that goes back to, Magnolia and BJ. So I don't know. I was slightly disappointed in this. I was still interested enough to, I finished it, so I have been DNFing a lot of books. I finished this book, so that's saying something. Okay, let's move right along, because we could be here all day if I just keep this up, right? We could truly be here all day. Okay, the next book that I read, after I read that book, I was really in the mood for something fast-paced, and so I decided to go with a thriller that has been sort of like in my periphery for a really long time, but I was afraid of it. I was afraid it was going to be too brutal, it was going to be too graphic, and it definitely was very, very graphic. this book actually was, you know, like, you hear about this author, it's Karen Slaughter, The Good Daughter. You hear about this author a lot on BookTube. Like, she's very well known. People talk about her a lot, and they usually either talk about The Good Daughter or Pretty Girls, both of which I read this month, which I'll talk about. But it was sort of brought back to my awareness last summer when I was hanging out with Sam from Sam Reads a Little before she moved away from Utah. Sad. And she was telling me about some thrillers that she had read that she really enjoyed, and The Good Daughter was one of them. And I started it, and I actually have a vlog where I did start it, but it was so graphic for me at the time that I was just like, I don't feel like I can read it right now. And then I don't know what came over me in September, but I was just like, I want something that is going to just absolutely grip me. Maybe it's because I'm still in the depth of this reading slump, but I just thought, you know, I don't know how I could go wrong here. So I started reading it. I think it was like a 20-ish hour audiobook, maybe 20, 24 hours, I don't know. Audiobooks are excellent, by the way. And let me just tell you, I was riveted. This book swept me away. I listened to the entire thing in 2 days, which is very fast for me. Like, I could not stop listening to it. When I had to stop, I was thinking about it. I couldn't wait to get back to it. And I haven't had that feeling about a book in so long. I feel like so many of the books that I've been reading this year, even the ones that I've given 5 stars, have been that I've really enjoyed. I've enjoyed my time reading them. But it's very rare for me to find a book that compels me so much that I can't stop thinking about it once I have to put it down. But most of the time I'm just like, oh yeah, I want to read. I like reading. That'll be fun, you know. But to have a book just like grab me by the throat is rare. And The Good Daughter did that so much for me. Like, this book was so freaking good. I gave it 5 stars. I was just absolutely obsessed. And then I immediately went into another Karen Slaughter. But The Good Daughter is basically about it feels a little reminiscent of In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, where you are watching this crime happen to this family, this mother and her 2 daughters, some very violent crimes. Like, if you are interested in Karen Slaughter, I really want you to know that she is not afraid to put graphic violence on the page. Like, some pretty gruesome descriptions of murder, rape, torture, things like that. Like, it's visceral, like, truly. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of arguments for, is that necessary? But I do feel like that lends so much power to the story she's telling. I feel weird saying that, but that's how I felt with The Good Daughter. So this is basically about, you see the beginning scene with the crimes that happens to the family. The mother is killed and the 2 daughters, you know, the sisters, are then trying to make their life again. It fast forwards to the future where we see them living their life, and one of them has come out very damaged and not unscathed at all. I mean, both of them have come out damaged, but one is more physically damaged and the other one is really sort of hanging on to some mental and emotional trauma. And so we're trying to see how they're living their lives now, and there's a little bit of like a mystery in solving a crime and all that other stuff, and it was just so compelling. And the thing that I think is so fascinating about Karen Slaughter's books specifically is it's not just like a thrill ride. It's not just like this happens, or what's going to happen. I don't know. Like, it's not just the mystery. It's not just the fast pace, because honestly, a lot of these books aren't fast paced. I mean, most of Karen Slaughter's books are pretty fast paced, but not all of them. But the thing that makes it just so utterly compelling is the way that she paces it, so that you usually start out with a very traumatic scene that is the crime that you don't have all the answers to. So then for the rest of the book, you're sort of trying to figure out what happened and how is it affecting these characters. So she does pacing excellently. Like, this is probably one of the most excellently paced books that I have ever read in my life. It was so freaking good. But she also has such a strong grasp of characterization. She creates characters and family relationships, family dynamics that have you feeling so much for these characters. And I just think that the combination of the crime that's happening, the mystery surrounding it, sort of that trauma, and then you have these characters that feel very fully fleshed out, very interesting, very lovable and endearing, even if they are really doing some morally gray types of things, like a lot of them are. But they have this, she does a lot of like specifically sister relationships that is just absolutely compelling. And I just find her books to be the type of thriller that transcends thrillers, you know? I think that I've talked about this a little bit in my vlogs, where you have genres, you have books in genres, and you have like the greats, like you've got the great romances, you've got the sort of average romances, and then you've got kind of the lower ones that are just like not great at all. And I think that for me, Karen Slaughter is a great, like, this feels like a family drama, a family saga, a mystery, a thriller. it was fantastic. I was just gobsmacked, and I was like, wow, now I know what I'm doing for the rest of the month, and I did. I read 3 more Karen Slaughters. The next book that I read was False Witness. I also gave this book 5 stars. This one was published in 2021, and this was interesting because it also starts with this crime in the beginning, some really horrific things that happen to the protagonist, and then it fast forwards to the future, and you're getting to see them sort of living their life and dealing with the trauma that comes along with those traumatic events. And this one specifically is about the female main character was a babysitter, and she was a victim of some pretty severe manipulation and child abuse as, you know, sexual assault when she was a teenager, that ends in her doing a violent act to try and save herself and her sister. And years and years and years pass, and one of the sisters is now a lawyer, and she is representing the son of the man who committed those crimes against her sister. And he is giving her the impression that he knows what happened that night. He knows what they did to his father and how they killed him. And so it's just so completely compelling. And again, this one had a great sister relationship. It was very fast-paced. This book was interesting because it was published in 2021, and so there is like a very real modern-day feel to this book where you're talking about like COVID protocols and wearing masks in the courthouse and things like that. And personally, that didn't like bother me, but like I don't want to read about COVID. It wasn't enough to dim my enjoyment, but it was also just sort of like I would like to escape into fiction and act like COVID didn't exist, you know? So that one was also really good, 5 stars. And then the next book that I read by Karen Slaughter was Pretty Girls, which, oh my gosh. So this was the 3rd book that I read by Karen Slaughter, and this is the book that is like referred to as her opus. Like, this is the one she's most well known for. It is praised pretty much everywhere, and I can completely see why. I also gave this one 5 stars, and this one is my favorite Karen Slaughter book that I read, and this one is definitely in my favorite books of the month. Like, it was so completely engrossing. This one also had trigger warnings, like extensive trigger warnings for torture, rape, murder, assault, like everything in there. But the way that this story unfolded, the twists and turns about this was just absolutely fantastic. And again, this one has a really sort of complicated sister dynamic, and it was just fantastic. Like, I don't even really want to tell you anything about this because I don't want to spoil it for you if you haven't been already. If you are not afraid, or not, I don't want to say that. If you don't feel like the content in these books would be triggering, and this one is definitely the most gruesome out of all of these. Like, it's pretty graphically described what happens to these girls, these murders that these 2 sisters are involved. They're not committing the murders, but they were haunted by them, and they're trying to solve the mystery and get out of danger themselves. The things that happen to those girls is graphically depicted, so I completely understand if that's not your cup of tea. But if you don't have triggers and you want just a completely masterful thriller with twists and turns that you're not going to expect, like, I would highly recommend this book. It was fantastic. 5 stars. Like, this is a book that has haunted me since I closed it, and I cannot stop thinking about it. Like, it was so freaking good. I adored it. It was just fantastic. I mean, adored it, is that really the right word for this type of content? I don't know. It was freaking fantastic, though. This was just chef's kiss. 10 out of 10. This book is probably going to be on my best books of the year because it was just that good. Like, I was astounded at her ability to tell this story and handle those really graphic details and not have them feel gratuitous and have it have such an impact on you as the reader and on the characters. Like, I think that if this story, because it surrounds so much of, like, sexual assault, I think if this had been told by a male writer, like, I'm sorry to say this, I would have a difficult time picking that up. But Karen Slaughter is able to write that in a way that really helps you feel a lot of empathy and sorrow, and it doesn't ever feel gratuitous. Like, okay, we'll move on from Karen Slaughter, but that was fantastic. Oh, wait, I have one more. This was not my last book of the month. This was towards the end of the month. But I want to talk about all of Karen Slaughter's books right now. This book is Pieces of Her. There actually is a Netflix show of this book, which I haven't watched. But the reason I read this one is because Karen had a new book come out this year, I think in August, and it's actually sort of like a spin-off from this book, and so I wanted to kind of have the background so that I could go into her new book. And this is the only book out of the 4 of hers that I have read so far that I found to be disappointing. The pacing was very, very slow. The plot was really not interesting. It didn't have that powerful family dynamic that I felt like the other books did, even though this one had the setup to really have that there and be powerful. I also feel like she uses flashbacks so often in her books to tell what happened in the past with the people in the future when they've grown up and they're, you know, usually trying to solve the mystery and deal with that trauma. I felt like the flashbacks in here were not effective because it really slowed down the pace of the story, and it just felt like very disconnected. Whereas before, in her other books, when she would use flashbacks, it still felt like a tight, cohesive, all-in-one narrative, even though you're in 2 different timelines. Pieces of her just sort of felt like a big hot mess, and I struggled to finish this one. I didn't want to pick it up. I was just sort of like not invested in the character. The heroine, the main female protagonist, was very immature for a 30-year-old. She just seemed like super naive, and I don't know. That one was a miss. So I love Karen Slaughter, but I don't recommend that one. I mean, maybe watch the Netflix show if you're curious, but the plot of this one isn't even really that great. It's just sort of like, it's surrounding like a terrorist plot and what happened with her mom. Like it opens with this shooting at a mall, basically. And then the main female protagonist is with her mom at lunch, and she watches her mom completely disarm this shooter with skills that an ordinary mother or housewife would never have, and that is what ignites this whole big mystery into who really is my mother. And you find out it's this sort of terrorist type of plot, and I don't know, it was very underwhelming, and I gave it 3 stars. I feel like that's generous. I feel like it's probably more of a 2, because I honestly didn't like this at all, and it put me off so much that I wasn't even in the mood to pick up her new book. I was just like, I don't even want to read that anymore. I'm sad because I went from Pretty Girls, which was fantastic, to Pieces of Her, which was a hot mess, and it was disappointing. Anyway, okay. The next book that I read is simply Unforgettable. This book is the first in a new series it's not a new series, it's new to me. This is basically sort of like a spin-off of the Bedouin Saga. You do see some of the Bedouin characters in here, and I enjoyed this a ton. This was just absolutely beautiful. This had such a fun opening scene where the hero and heroine are snowed in together, and it was just so adorable. This had all of the charm that I loved from the Bedouin Saga. It had a really good pace. It had really great characters. I loved how the hero really sort of fell for her when they were snowed in together in that snowstorm, and they like build a snowman, and it was just charming and romantic, and I just adored it, and I gave it 5 stars, and it made me really happy. So I need to finish the series. I only read the first book this month, but this was adorable, and I think that I would definitely recommend this to any historical romance fan. I think it's very readable. It's just a delight, a charming delight. Okay, the next book that I read is Daisy Darker. This is also a thriller. This is the first book that I've read by this author, and this book was my most disappointing book of the month. So disappointing. I gave this book 1 star. It's sort of a modern day retelling on Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. So the basic premise of that is all of these people, in this case it's a family, they go to this island, and one by one they're killed, and you're trying to figure out who the murderer is. And this book also had flashbacks, and they were very ineffective. I felt like it's very tough to pull off flashbacks, especially in like a crime or a thriller or mystery where the pace is supposed to be like amping up so much, because inevitably when you get a flashback, it's going to drop you back down a little bit. And after reading all the Karen Slaughters and then coming to this one, it was like very apparent to me that this author, in this specific circumstance, the flashbacks really didn't work. All that it did was slow down the pace. The flashbacks were not interesting really at all. They were not tied so closely to the overall mystery, and I just felt like, like this book had a ton of murders happening, and I honestly could care less. I really didn't like any of the characters, and that's something that like I need to feel in my mystery and thrillers. Like I have to feel a connection with the characters in order to feel that sense of danger, like what's going to happen to them. I don't want anything to happen to them, and oh my gosh, what's coming, like what mystery are we unsolving here, and why do I even care about that? Like I am not the type of reader who reads like just for action or just for events to happen. Like I need to feel invested in those characters in order for anything else to matter to me, and that just definitely didn't happen here. This book also uses a device that is the grand reveal at the end that I absolutely hate. It's one of 2. I have 2 plot devices in mystery and thrillers that when it is used, I get so angry because it's a lazy, cheap trick that is just intended to make you feel like it was this big twist when really I'm just like, are you freaking kidding me? Are you serious right now? And that's what happened here. So 1 star for that one, didn't like it at all. And then I read Belladonna. This is a YA fantasy novel, and I absolutely adored this. I loved it so much. This is beautifully written. It has a bit of a Regency romance feel, but maybe lower on the romance. Like, this book had great chemistry and tension between Death and our heroine Signa. There's an event that happens early on where Signa almost dies, and she ends up seeing Death, and so they're connected through the rest of her life. And she's always really close to Death, and she gets to have this opportunity where she sees people either leave and then she sees Death right there, or she sort of uses that relationship with him to pull them back from the brink of death, and then she gets to see Death again as well. There's also an overall mystery plot to this that was really interesting and fascinating, and I just felt like this was just an absolute and utter gothic, mysterious, I was going to say swoony, but that's not quite the right word, like chemistry-filled adventure that, I don't know if adventure is the right word either. It was just a really great book. Like, I adored it. I thought it was fantastic. I kind of want to read it over again, and let me tell you what, like, Death and the Maiden is probably my all-time favorite trope. I will literally read any book that is blurbed as Death and the Maiden. This book is one of the only that I have read that comes close to what I'm looking for in a Death and the Maiden trope, where you have Death, who is doing his job, he's the Grim Reaper, and then we have the Maiden, who sort of either has some type of a deal with him, or in some respect, she is tied to him, and he doesn't want her to be because he wants her to live, but then he's also like conflicted because he wants her, and it's just so freaking good. And I love the complexities that arise in that type of a relationship where we have like Death and the Maiden, and I think that you could make the argument that Signa isn't necessarily, because she has touched and seen Death, she's not quite as maidenly as some of the other, you know, females would be in this type of a trope, but she had this really powerful draw with Death that was just absolutely compelling, and I just honestly loved this. I thought it was great, and it made me want to read more YA fantasy because it was that good. Okay, the next book that I read is Finding Gene Kelly by Tori Jean. This book was just such a delight. I adored every single page of this. This book is a contemporary romance with a big emphasis on the heroine having endometriosis, and that really affects her life in every way. It's a big part of this book, her learning to live with that, learning to love herself, sort of the fears and insecurities that come along with that, and how that would affect her romantic relationship. And I just loved it. I loved watching Evie's story. It's set in Paris. She runs this travel blog, and she's also really interested in baking and cooking, and she is just an absolute delight who struggles with insecurities, but also is just like gripped with this big sense of seize the day type of attitude, which I really loved. And then we have Liam Kelly, who is the hero, who has had a crush on her and has had feelings for her since high school. You know, they started to be high school sweethearts, and then something happened where she felt like he had kind of betrayed her and it was all a lie, so there's a little bit of like an antagonism between them, and he is just the ultimate cinnamon roll hero. I loved him. I loved watching him love and take care of her. This book was just felt like a warm hug, and I loved it, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. This book is written really well too. Tori has a great sense of humor, but not like in an over-the-top type of way. Like, I feel like her humor is very charming, and it's inserted into her characters' actions and their dialogue, and some of it is a little tiny bit quirky, but it really works with the characters here, and I just adored it. I gave it 5 stars. Okay, let's see. What is next? Okay, the next book that I read is How the Wallflower Was Won by Ava Leigh. This is the second book in her series, and I freaking adored this book. I gave it 5 stars. I feel like I liked this book even better than the first one. This book basically has our hero and heroine. So the premise of this series is the hero, there's a group of heroes who need to marry and restore like their reputation, or their parents are going to cut them off from any financial help in the future. So they're on this timeline to marry. And in this book, the hero decides to set up the heroine, who is a very bookish, scholarly heroine, with Dom, who's the hero of the next book, and he's thinking that they would have a marriage of convenience there, and he would have one more of the 3 of them taken care of and getting married. And he does that because he feels very inferior intellectually. Like, it sounds like he has a learning disability, he struggles to read, and he just feels like he's not going to be a good match for the heroine, who is so bookish and scholarly, even though they have a really good connection and also some great chemistry. And I just adored this. Pretty soon they realize, or he realizes, that he would actually prefer marrying her, so they enter into this marriage. It starts out as a marriage of convenience, and they have this really beautiful, tentative friendship that turns into love, where they're both sort of extending a little bit of vulnerability and waiting to see how it's reciprocated, how it's received, and it was just charming and beautiful, and I just loved it. I felt like the depth of emotion in this book was very palpable, and I felt like there was a really good balance of heat and attraction, but also like the attraction that is powered not only just by how each character looks, but who they are on the inside. And that's something that I think Ava does really, really well. I think it is just way too common to have romances where the attraction is just how they look or how they appear or even how they make you feel, instead of seeing things like on a deeper level and who that person really is and things that actually might make you feel something for them other than just they're really hot, you know? So I loved it. I gave it 5 stars, and I can't wait for the next one. Okay, the next book that I read is Surrender by Amanda Quick. I read this for our Rake Appreciation Society live show. I talked about it extensively there. I gave it 2 stars. I wasn't a fan. I was disappointed. Moving right along. Okay, so the next book that I read is Duke Most Wicked by Lenora Bell, and I gave this book 3 stars. This book was fun, and it was sweet, and it was low angst. I think this is probably actually a little higher angst for Lenora Bell, who I feel like in general writes historical romances that are fairly low angst. This was sweet and cute, and it was a very pleasant read. Like, I didn't hate reading this. I didn't want to, like, stop reading it or DNFing it, but I was left feeling like something was lacking in this book. So I did give it 3 stars. This is also so the heroine is a governess. Her father is a famous musician. She is teaching, well, she's not actually a governess. She's like their music teacher. She's teaching the Duke's younger sisters music lessons, and he had a secret told to him by his father who hated him when he was very young, and he was sent away, and he has just sort of been living a life of debauchery ever since, because he's like, I'm no good, I'm an evil guy, I'm cursed, I've got all this shame on me because of what happened, and so he has this life of just wickedness. And the thing that really made me not like this book is because, like, when there comes a point when he has to come back and be responsible for his sisters, and he's the heir, and he's going to, you know, trying to make sure they have good marriages and all that stuff. And I think the thing that made me really not like this book was twofold, and one of them was that the hero experienced very little growth throughout the book until the very end, and that's something that was always just disappointing for me. I want to see the progression of my hero growing, especially if he's a wicked duke. Like, I want to see him changing more than I thought he did in this book. But also, I just was not 100% sold on why the heroine even really loved him at all in the first place. Like, she is so smitten with him. She's been pining for him forever, and it wasn't really returned. Like, if a heroine is going to pine, I want the hero to be pining too. I don't want to read just about a heroine pining. Like, that's not fun. I don't like that. I want to see the hero pining. I sure do. I don't really care if she's pining, you know? and he liked her, but it was more based on his attraction for her. And I think a lot of that plays into the trope of, oh, she's the school teacher and I'm so attracted to her. And it just felt like, it felt a little bit trite and overdone, and it just was lacking the emotional depth and maturity that I was hoping that it had. And yeah, I was disappointed. So 3 stars. I mean, I say I was disappointed because I came off of this after just reading the Ava Lay, which I enjoyed so much more. And this just felt very pale and lackluster in comparison to the emotional power that was in the Ava Lay for me. So this was a fun read, but it wasn't my type of read where I want layers and more emotional development and growth. It was fun. It was a good time, but it was very forgettable. Okay, now the next book that I read was Forever Right Now. I did vlog about this, so I'm not going to be talking about it too much. This is an older book by Emma Scott. It's a contemporary romance, and this book was just absolutely delightful. It's a single dad romance. He ends up having a one-night stand with someone, you know, like a year passes and she shows up on his doorstep with this baby, and she's like, oh, surprise, this is your baby. And then she just like basically leaves, and he ends up becoming like dad of the year. Like, he is such a good dad. It's so beautiful to watch the way he just loved this little baby and like bought her organic fruits and vegetables and was just such a devoted dad. And the heroine in this book is a former drug addict. She moves to San Francisco to try and reignite her career as a dancer, which got ruined from her drug abuse and addiction. And that it's their romance, and there's a lot of complexity to the relationship, and there is some like emotional stuff they have to overcome, some past trauma, some trust issues, but it never felt like it dwelled in that area too much. It felt like just the perfect blend for what this story was trying to do, and I just really, really enjoyed it. It was so good. I gave it 5 stars. I loved it. It was fantastic. If you like a single dad romance, you gotta check that one out, because it was definitely worth it. If you haven't already, again, it's been out for a while. Okay, and the last book that I read, which was my favorite book of the month, is Restore Me by J.L. Seegers. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. This is the discreet cover, which I bought immediately after reading it, and let me just tell you, this book, like, consumed my life. When I was talking about the Karen Slaughter books and how I just could not stop thinking about it, how I could not put it down, how I wanted to read it when I wasn't, like, just that desire to just get lost in the pages, like, that's exactly what happened to me with this book. And that hasn't happened with me in a romance in a while, and I just was so completely lost in this romance. I loved it so much. It's a contemporary romance. It is a second chance romance. Sort of, it has a soulmate type of feel to it. When the opening prologue is the hero and heroine meeting when they're both in college, and they have like this just very charged meeting where some of the lines in that first meeting just like live rent-free in my head, where they both come from pretty, not abusive homes. Well, he did for sure. His father abused his mother, but she comes from a home where her mother was really pretty emotionally abusive to her, so they're both kind of dealing with that trauma, and they meet at a time in their life where they're finally free of that. They're on their own, they're going to college, but they still have like the shadows of that darkness lurking in them. So when they meet, we're reading it from the hero's point of view, and you can see this moment where he says, I could see that she had the same type of darkness that I did. And I was just like, I'm gone. From that point, I was just completely gone. And then we progress to in the future, where our heroine actually forgot that meeting. Like, there was something that happened where she could not remember it. And she is now a widow. She had married that hero, like our hero, his brother. So it's complicated. And he has been dead for 4 years. She's trying to move on with her life. She ends up working on this job with Dom, the hero, that she doesn't remember meeting from the first meeting. And they have this antagonistic relationship, and that's really been a cover for Dom's feelings for her and his feeling frustrated that she didn't remember that powerful meeting that just really changed his life. And oh my goodness, this book was fantastic. I honestly loved it so much. The way this man loved her, best hero of the year. Best hero of the year. The way he loved her, how sweet, how tender, how just, oh my gosh. I cannot get over how much he loved her and how much I loved this book. It was so beautiful. I'm never going to stop thinking about it. Definitely one of my favorite books of the year. Probably top 3. Maybe even favorite. I don't know at this point. But I loved it so much. So, alright, there we go. I was trying to keep this video short, but of course, I just talked too much. Thank you so much for watching, my friends. I hope you enjoyed this video. And yeah, I will see you in my next one.